Revenge films.
I was working as a receptionist at a certain hospital. In this particular hospital where I worked, on the usual days off, every department would have what we called a holiday duty doctor. That day, I was on holiday duty, and I was working the reception with one of my female senior colleagues. However, knowing that I had to spend the entire day working with this particular colleague had put me in a negative mood from the start of the day. That was because she could always put the blame on anyone else, even if it was very clearly her own mistake. She would always be rude to patients and treat them with terrible customer service. And she would talk badly about the patients loudly enough for everyone else to be able to hear her. These patients were coming to the hospital because they were either sick or not feeling well, and yet she would harshly speak to them as if it was their fault. I was always put in a bad mood anytime I had to work with her. And it wasn't just me, she was also disliked by the other receptionists as well as all of the other nurses. That being said, work was work, and so I put my head down and started my job that morning next to this senior colleague of mine. However, that afternoon I had gone to the back to do the office work while she handled the reception. When a man arrived with a very exhausted-looking boy, probably around preschool age.
"My son has a fever of 100 degrees. Please let him see the doctor,"
he asked. At that time, my colleague was sitting at the desk, and after letting out a large sigh, she said, "You know you should have called ahead," and saying things like, "Why don't you just go to a regular family doctor when they open tomorrow?" Without an inkling of sympathy. In response to my colleague, the father desperately insisted,
"My child is suffering from a very high fever. A regular doctor is in an office today. And when I looked it up, I saw this hospital was open in the holiday duty doctor today. I apologize for not calling ahead. However, you're open today for these exact reasons, and you still won't let my son be seen by the doctor? If not, then please tell the hospital director that Stephen Skidmore is here."
The child definitely didn't seem well, and you could tell with one look that he was feeling really rough. And yet my colleague sighed again and ignored the child as she rolled her eyes at the father. Why are you ignoring them when there's a child there that clearly needs help? My colleague had absolutely zero intention of helping this father and his child, so I stepped in. "I'd be happy to take you guys over here. Would you mind filling out this paperwork with just the main necessary information?" I ushered them over to the other side of the reception desk, and the father's child said,
"Thank you very much,"
as he shook my hand with relief. Suddenly, the child must have got nauseous out of nowhere and threw up on the spot. When my colleague saw that, she had a disgusted look on her face and said, "Are you serious? That's so gross, and it smells awful. This is exactly why I said you should just go to your own doctor tomorrow. Please hurry and clean it up," she said as she turned her back to us. Even the other parents around the room were shocked by her reaction. I felt like she had really crossed the line, so I turned and said, "There are patients around us, you know." And she only had one response. "And?" The father was apologizing profusely for his child, unintentionally vomiting everywhere. But even the other patients stepped in to support them, saying,
"Don't worry about it. It happens to the best of us. Your child must be feeling really sick,"
and were doing their best to cheer them up. One of the nurses came out, and I helped her to clean it up. When I returned to the reception, "Hey, can you not come over here? I can smell it even from a mile away." She stopped me a few feet from the desk. On top of that, "I can't believe you actually cleaned that up. If you touch something like that, you know you're going to get sick too." I had finally reached my limit, and despite the fact that we were still in front of other patients, I sternly said back to her, "This is a hospital. You need to be more careful with your words, and there is a chance that a child has something very serious and needs to be treated immediately." When I said that, my colleague looked over at the father and his child and shrugged. "It's obviously just a cold, and that idiot parent is overreacting. We're exhausted over here with so much work coming to us every single day. I wish they would just stop adding to our workload for something so small. And who does he think he is asking us to tell the doctor that some Stephen Skid whatever is here? Why would the director care or know anyone like that anyway? If anything, isn't he embarrassed trying to name drop himself like that?" And went on a rant for everyone to hear. Because all the other patients were around us, I couldn't raise my voice either. Holiday duty doctors are there for emergency purposes. which means it's very common for irregular patients to show up. Plus, as a simple receptionist, my colleague had absolutely no right to try to diagnose a patient, much less denying them the right to see a doctor. It's not even like you're going to be treating the patient yourself, so why does it bother you so much? My frustration was truly reaching its peak when suddenly the child started having a seizure. I ran to go get the nurse and the child was immediately escorted inside. At that moment, with perfect timing, the hospital director had just come downstairs, and he saw the father and child.
What happened? My son's fever wouldn't go down, so I brought him to the hospital. I thought maybe you might be here too, but then this person!
The father spoke to the hospital director as he glared over at my colleague. She whispered, "What? You actually know the hospital director? This has to be a joke," as her face turned completely pale. The child was the priority, so the hospital director went with the father into the exam room to check on the child and disappeared from the waiting room. It turns out that the little boy had meningitis and was immediately checked into the hospital. He was transferred to the pediatric ward on a stretcher. After a while, the father and the hospital director came back down from the pediatric ward together. By that time, most of the patients had left and the hospital had become quiet. The hospital director walked straight over to my colleague and looked her directly in the eye.
I heard from my friend Mr. Skidmore here that you had quite the attitude earlier.
So it was true that he was a friend of yours, Director?
Not only is he a friend, he is the president of the company that supplies this hospital with some of the most important medical equipment.
No way!
I heard from Mr. Skidmore, but why don't you explain to me why you refused to accept his son into this hospital?
He asked my colleague, to which she replied, "Well, it just didn't seem like he was actually that sick or that it was a serious condition." She tried to explain herself but was flustered, and it was all a string of excuses. The hospital director lost it, yelling,
That's not for you to decide at all! Who gave you any right to make that call? And more importantly, you're not a nurse and definitely not a doctor. So how would you even know? Were you trying to kill the child?
No, of course not. This wasn't my intention at all.
Because of your uneducated judgment, we were about to lose a young child, and his blood would have been on your hands. Do you have any idea what you've done?
I'm terribly sorry. I'm sorry.
There's no need for someone like you in this hospital. Go home now!
The hospital director had fully raised his voice at this point, and my quivering colleague had gotten down to her knees. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me," as she apologized profusely through her tears. After that incident, about a week had passed, and the child of the hospital director's friend had fully recovered. But by that time, my colleague was long gone. After that incident, the hospital director looked into my senior colleague in detail, speaking to the other receptionists and the nurses as well as the doctors, as more and more complaints and incidents came to light. On top of that, he found out that she had been prioritizing her family and friends and changing their reception times forward, as well as pushing back patients that she had decided she didn't like. As a result, there was a situation where a patient who had seemingly light symptoms was left waiting for so long that she was in critical condition by the time she was seen by a doctor, and we found out that her actions could easily be sued as neglect. Of course, the hospital did not forgive her for this. In reality, on the days that she was working reception, the patient feedback box would be stacked nearly 3 times the usual amount with complaints. However, the person that would usually be working the same shift as her would be a junior colleague, and one of them saw her throwing away those complaint papers before anybody else could see them. She had been keeping it to herself all this time, but she finally exploded and told the hospital director everything. Because of her, a lot of patients lost their faith and trust in our hospital, and I heard that the hospital decided to take her away to court for it. Of course, she didn't stand a chance, nor did she have any grounds to stand on, and despite turning completely pale, there was nowhere for her to escape. Once this senior colleague was laid off by the hospital, another senior colleague who always took her side also quit, and we all celebrated. And it wasn't just the employees. When our patients found out that she was no longer working at the hospital, "That woman's not here today?" "What?" "Oh, yes, due to some reason she's quit the hospital." "Oh, well, is that so? I always felt uneasy around that woman. I know I shouldn't say this, but I'm quite glad to hear that." We had numerous people share the same opinion, and it made me realize just how terrible she had been to so many patients over the years. When that father and son from that incident were discharged from the hospital, they came back over to see me.
Thank you very much for stepping in at that time. Thanks to you, my child's life was saved.
Oh, please, I was just doing my job. If anything, I should be apologizing to you for my colleague's behavior and that it took us so long to have your child be seen by the doctor. In order to ensure that something like that never happens again, we are doing company-wide trainings as well. Please take care, both of you. We exchanged our thanks with one another as they left. Sure, a hospital receptionist doesn't have the ability to save somebody's life like a nurse or a doctor could, but it's still an important role as the first person that the patient interacts with when they arrive at the hospital seeking help. My senior colleague didn't understand the responsibility of the job, nor did she take pride in her work, and I really hate her for it. I later found out that she was sued by the hospital for an unimaginably high cost of damages. But for someone who didn't understand the value of people's lives, nor care for their health, I thought it was a perfectly fitting punishment.
How was today's video? If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Stay tuned for more.